Today's webinar is entitled The World on Lockdown, Global COVID-19 Related Travel Restrictions and the Impact on Transatlantic Business. It's brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, which is where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. And because I forgot to start the recording, I'm just going to quickly reintroduce our panelists. Kerry Koski is a shareholder at Ogletree Deacons in Denver, focusing on immigration law. Dr. Stephen Langer joins us from New York. He is the founder of MPC Consultants. Jason Reed is in Boston. He's managing director of FTI Consulting and leads their technology transformation practice. Bobby Spann is a vice president for external affairs at the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport. He's also a member of the EACC board of directors here in Cincinnati. And Will Taylor is a partner at the Trial and Dispute Resolution Practice Group at Pepper Hamilton and joins us from Boston. Our time is limited this morning, as you know, and there are so many things to cover. So let's quickly get started with Kerry Koski. Kerry, could you start us with just a quick overview of why are we talking about travel restrictions between the United States and Europe, and even within Europe?
Thank you so much, Todd, and thanks to the European American Chamber of Commerce and my colleagues co-presenting today. What we're experiencing right now started on March 11th with the President's proclamation, and we're calling it the Schengen area travel ban. It went into effect 12 a.m. on Saturday morning and impacts nationals of 26 European countries. Everybody might know that the UK and Ireland have also been added to that. And the intent of it is to curb the spread of this COVID-19 virus. Now, what's interesting about this travel ban is that when the president announced it, he said that it would be in effect for 30 days. But there's no formal termination date in the proclamation. We do not expect it to be shorter than 30 days, but it could go much longer. The president has authority to issue these proclamations and to implement them based on a constitutional conference of authority to make decisions in connection with national security. So the president has characterized this as a national security concern and thereby implementing this ban, which is now in effect. Just some background, you know, we might go back to 2017 when this administration implemented a ban for Muslim majority countries. That ban was challenged, and the Supreme Court ordered on that in 2018 and said essentially that yes, the president has authority to make decisions in connection with national security, and this is exactly what that is. So it's the same idea and concept. So what does this travel ban mean for Europeans in that Schengen area and then Ireland and Dublin? Well, those who have been physically present in those areas and countries within 14 days of attempting to enter the United States will not be admitted, except for enumerated reasons, and you know, it's logical and reasonable. U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, spouses of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents and their children are not impacted by this travel ban. However, they must self-quarantine themselves after entering the United States for at least 14 days. And we're seeing that as a norm, really globally, that 14-day self-quarantine or quarantine. Those folks who are accepted under the ban will be required to enter at one of 13 airports with advanced screening. So it's not going to be a pleasant re-entry to the United States for those folks. Now, the Schengen area travel restriction has really escalated over the last week. We began monitoring global immigration services and really the domino effect. On the 18th, there were a couple of major announcements, March 18th, which I think was Wednesday, yeah. Embassies and consulates have suspended visa services worldwide. Only in emergency situations will visas be issued. What that means is that there will be no visa applications, no visa issuances. Folks who need a visa to travel to the United States should postpone their plans. We're saying really for 3 to 6 months. Consulates will resume as soon as they can, but folks should anticipate a backlog. And again, that's why we say potentially 3 to 6 months before visas are issued and folks can enter the United States. I did also want to mention the US-Canada border situation. On Wednesday, Justin Trudeau announced that Canada was shutting its borders to the US. Trudeau and Trump have been discussing and have come to an agreement, a reciprocal agreement, where all non-essential travel has been will be restricted essentially. So recreational travel, tourism, if you have plans to go to Canada or Canadians to come to the US, that will be restricted. The last point that I wanted to make has to do with this level 4 travel advisory that was issued yesterday by the US Department of State. The Secretary of State increased that advisory from level 3, saying it wasn't enough to ask US citizens to reconsider their international travel. Instead, we have to, Department of State, from their point of view, issue a warning that says do not travel. So not merely reconsider, but do not travel. US citizens should not depart the United States. If you are overseas and you're a US citizen, return now or plan to stay where you are for the long term. This is unprecedented. There have been a lot of commentary from Department of State officials and other folks connected to the government that have commented that this has just never happened before. So this level 4 travel advisory is in effect. People can't come in, people can't go out, and we really think that this is going to have a 3 to 6 month impact on all global travel. Foreign nationals that are currently working in the United States should plan to stay here. Foreign nationals and companies that were planning to transfer US folks to the US should plan on postponing those plans 3 to 6 months and make arrangements for folks to work outside of the United States remotely. Of course, there may be, other employer obligations, payroll taxes that have to be considered. But again, we are helping employers navigate the situation, and the state of the situation is delays and postponement. That's really it. We are learning more every day. There could be more announcements today that impact U.S. immigration, but that concludes my part of the presentation.
Carrie, I see while we're here, there's 2 quick questions that came in for you. One, I think is particularly important. What happens to visa holders? I'm assuming this is U.S. visa holders whose visa expired during the travel ban. Normally, they need to leave the country and get those renewed. Now that's impossible. Any suggestions or thoughts on how those cases are being handled?
So there are really 2 situations that we're seeing come up. The first is those folks who would travel visa-free with visa waiver or ESTA, and I believe there are almost 40 countries that participate in that program. Certain ports of entry like JFK, Newark, Raleigh have announced that they will extend ESTA from 90 days to an additional 30 days. So you're looking at a total of 120 days based on this COVID-19 situation. But those business travels or tourism travelers using ESTA or the visa waiver program need to contact their port of entry customs and border agents in order to get that benefit. Visa holders who are in the United States and their visa status is expiring, those people need to file in-country extensions to USCIS. And as a workforce immigration attorney, I'm advising clients to adjust their strategies instead of having folks travel and renew their visas to go ahead and extend their visa status inside the United States with USCIS. This is a very typical routine process and something that we do all of the time. Employers should feel very comfortable extending status in the United States. If the petition is filed late, meaning status has already expired, there are regulations that allow for certain exceptions if that delay was beyond the control of the company or the employee, which I think there's a very good argument for right now.
Steve, do you want to take just a minute, maybe talk about the kind of the medical implications of this? I mean, would you think these travel bans are actually going to? I mean, they're intended to slow the spread of the virus. Do you think that's actually going to work?
No, I think when President Trump first initiated the travel ban from China, that probably was helpful in minimizing the spread here. But it is a very virulent virus. The travel ban that was initiated from the Schengen area and the UK, I think was far too little too late. The idea that we would screen people here effectively without adequate resources was I think, a plan that was doomed to fail. If you looked at the pictures, for instance, at O'Hare Airport, where there were thousands of people waiting hours online, that's exactly what we didn't want to happen. We did not want people, we want social, separation, and that wasn't happening there. And then the other idea was that people would coming back in will self-quarantine, I think is really a false hope. Most people coming in were not going to spend 14 days at home. There were no special areas where they were going to. There were no hotels or ships or places where we're putting them. So the virus has been spreading. And unfortunately now what we're seeing is the virus, I think, is mutating. I think some recent studies have shown that. And it is crossing all borders. Unless you're going to shut the country down and prevent anybody from entering, you will continue to have cross-border contamination. And that's in Europe, that'll be in Asia, Africa, wherever. I think this virus now is about 140 different countries. And it is changing. We're finding, for instance, that younger people are getting sicker than they anticipated. Initially, it was mostly older people they were concerned about. We are seeing people in the 20s and 30s getting very ill now. And of course, what's going to happen in this country is overwhelming our medical capabilities on in very short order.
Obviously, we could talk lots and lots and lots about this specific topic, but I want to make sure we get through all of our speakers. Let me turn quickly to Bobby Spann at CVG Airport. Bobby, CVG is one of the only airports in the Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky tri-state to have direct service to and from Europe. How are these restrictions impacting that service, passenger traffic at CVG overall, and then maybe you can comment briefly on the shorter and longer term impacts this travel ban or travel restrictions might have on the industry more broadly.
Sure, Todd. It's a pleasure to be with you and the other panelists this morning. Obviously, the aviation industry, the airports and the airlines are being impacted in a way that we haven't experienced since 9/11. And we thought 9/11 was our benchmark of crisis in our history. And we are now seeing the coronavirus exceed the impact that we experienced back then when the industry was literally shut down for 3 or 4 days. For those of you who aren't familiar with the CVG, just a little bit of a background to kind of frame my comments. We're the airport that serves the Cincinnati area, the Southeast Ohio, Southwest Indiana, and Northern Kentucky. Approximately 3.4 million residents in our direct catchment area, but going out 120 miles, there's about 10.8 million residents that are subject to using CVG. As Todd said, we're one of the few airports in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana that provides nonstop transatlantic service. So a large portion of that 10.8 million residents rely on CVG to provide the gateway to Europe. Also, one of the unique things about CVG, we're the 7th largest cargo airport in North America with more than 1.2 million tons of cargo handled annually, most of that being international. We're home to one of 3 global super hubs by DHL, and we're also home to the new Amazon Prime Air Hub operation. The reason that's important is that we're seeing a tale of two stories. The passenger volumes are certainly decreasing at a rate we've never seen before, but on the opposite side, we're seeing a rebound in cargo operations, especially on the Trans-Pacific and Asian communities, where there was a lot of pent-up supply chain goods that needed to make its way into the U.S. as well as other points in North America. So cargo is certainly carrying a significant portion of the activity at the airport right now. From a airline perspective, again, just kind of recapping what we've seen over the last week and what we're expecting over the next 2 to 3 months. All airlines have announced drastic cuts in terms of their capacity. For example, if you look at some of the most recent announcements, American Airlines on March 16th announced a 75% year-over-year reduction in international capacity, as well as about a 30% reduction in their domestic capacity. That domestic capacity is now going to be nearing 50%. On March 18th, Delta announced that 70% of its international capacity was going to be reduced. That's now up to 80%. Over 600 airplanes are being parked for right now. United, much the same case, 60% reduction in capacity, with 85% of that being international. And then on our domestic side, we're starting to see Southwest, Alaska, Spirit, Allegiant, Frontier make similar type reductions. And we expect this to take place and continue over the next 30 to 60 days. So it's very important that the governments take this as serious. I believe that they are. The economic relief packages that are being proposed in Congress in the US, as well as the governments in Europe, are being recognized as a critical piece of the puzzle to get everybody back when the virus does subside. But we've never seen anything like this before, Todd, in terms of demand dropping, and we're going to have to adjust our plans almost on a daily basis. But look forward to taking questions from the participants as we get forward.
Bobby, just I think you mentioned this, but the Delta flight from Paris, I mean, that was or connecting Paris and Cincinnati. I mean, that is one of their most successful flights. Am I correct? I mean, we have no reason to. We fully expect that that's going to come back once this is all over, right?
Absolutely. One of the neat things about the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky market is that 1 out of every 3 transatlantic travelers, and to kind of put some points around that, about 1,500 people a day from our catchment area travel to Europe or take a transatlantic journey. Obviously, that's nowhere near those numbers today, but 1 out of every 3 passengers in that 1,500 are on some type of premium fare, business class type fare. So it's a very high revenue market for carriers across the transatlantic. So out of the 13 Paris operations that Delta has from the US to Paris, we are certainly in the top percentage of those gateways that they have to Paris. Of course, as of today, Delta has suspended all flights between the US and Paris. I think their last operation was from Atlanta, and that took place yesterday.
Yeah, these are definitely interesting times in the aviation industry. We'll see where things are going. I will point out Candace McGraw, who is Bobby's boss out at the airport, put out a wonderful video on Twitter the other day talking about the steps the airport has taken to make sure that folks stay safe. So really proud of the work that they do for our region. I want to move on to our next speaker. These travel restrictions, of course, are creating all kinds of problems for businesses, making it harder for them to get things done. Will Taylor at Pepper Hamilton, help us understand what kind of legal remedies or defenses companies and professionals might seek, given how these travel restrictions are impacting their ability to do their work, complete contracts, and so forth.
Sure. Thank you, Todd. So the remedies that Todd is referring to would be doctrines known as force majeure or impossibility or frustration of purpose. There are other names for them, but the sort of general concept is has an event occurred that has prevented a party from performing its obligations under a contract. That happens every day in the world, but the sort of pace of the events that are disrupting the contractual commitments between parties is obviously escalating at a rate that is unlike anything I've ever seen before, and I think that's true for everybody on this presentation. There is one example, though, just to sort of illustrate the sort of how the doctrine works. I'll start with force majeure. After 9/11, there were, of course, many impacts on the economy of the terrorist attacks in New York, and that rendered some parties either unable or unwilling to perform. So the starting place in those instances is to look at your contract and say, is there anything in the contract that would excuse my performance of my obligations? And one typical clause is the force majeure clause. It's a very well-established doctrine both in the US and in other countries, both civil law and common law countries. And the force majeure clause typically lists specific events that would be recognized as preventing the performance of a party. So in the context of 9/11, parties who were unable to perform or unwilling to perform would say the terrorist attacks and the related economic impacts have prevented me from performing, and therefore I declare force majeure. That was a heavily litigated issue, and what courts would look at is the specific language of the force majeure clause and see, is there anything like an act of terrorism listed in the force majeure clause? And most often it wasn't. Parties would try to rely on the act of war language, which often does appear in force majeure clauses. And the courts looked at that and said, no, war is between two national parties. And therefore terrorism is, and terrorism by definition is not, and therefore an act of terrorism does not fall under the act of war exception. This illustrates that force majeure clauses are interpreted really narrowly. So in our present situation, your starting point, if you are finding yourself unable to perform, or your business is, or your counterparty's business, or your counterparty is claiming difficulties with performing, the starting place has to be your contract. And look at that force majeure clause and see, does it list anything that, like specifically, does it list epidemics? Does it list pandemics? Does it list government regulation or government action? Because what we're seeing so far is that the two areas that are most directly, sort of obviously flowing from our current situation is, does the epidemic itself somehow prevent your performance of your obligations? Or does government regulation stemming from the pandemic prevent you from performing your obligations? In the case of an obligation that is tied to travel, that would be a pretty pertinent conversation or topic for this presentation. Let's say, for example, your contractual obligations required you're in Ireland and it requires you to travel from Ireland to the US. Well, if you're not allowed to travel from Ireland to the US anymore, then that would likely be the type of event that would be excused under a force majeure clause. If your force majeure clause has a government action, I'll call it, exception for performance. Having looked at some contracts, it is not whatsoever a given that it will include epidemics, pandemics, or government action. They are often really narrowly framed, and even more challenging if you're the non-performing party, they are very narrowly interpreted. One sort of ready example is act of God is often listed in force majeure clauses. There is a very significant debate about whether an epidemic would fall under that category. Some people say, what else would you call it? And others would say, well, no, you can chart this back to where it originated, and it was actually, had human activity that caused it. and therefore you cannot blame it on an act of God, which might be more appropriate, like a meteor shower or something like that. So that's not to say the force majeure clause is the only avenue for a defense to non-performance, because I should have said at the beginning, what we're looking for is if you're not performing, or you're unable to perform, are there defenses to that? Force majeure, impossibility, frustration of purpose, you're looking for the same problem, which is I can't perform, and the reason I can't perform is for something outside of my control, and that event was not contemplated by the parties when they entered into the contract. So if you could have foreseen that this was going to happen, but you didn't contract to shift the risk between one party or the other, then courts will hold you responsible for not being able to perform that obligation. That's sort of the general rule. And one will now ask for any future pandemic, if you entered into a contract starting today and you do not put in pandemic in the force majeure clause, a court might say, well, you knew that would happen. And maybe a court would even say that today. I mean, this is a remarkable event. That's to put it extremely lightly. But this is not the first epidemic. I think this is the third or fourth in this millennium. So this is, so courts might actually be less sympathetic, or less willing to interpret a force majeure clause as covering the COVID-19 events than you might expect, given how remarkable these events are. Another important aspect of these, I'll call these the hardship doctrines, is they don't excuse performance if it's just harder to do your obligation. So if it's more expensive, or it takes more effort, or if it takes more time, that is a risk that you essentially took when you entered into the contract. You can imagine it sort of on a spectrum, though, that if at one end of the extreme is that it would be so difficult to perform that obligation that it would be beyond what the parties were contemplating when they entered into the contract. Like it would be 100 times more expensive, or it would take 10 years instead of 1 year. That might rise to the level of impracticability, which is another doctrine, a related doctrine for commercial impracticability. So in those instances, you might get relief from the court, because the court would recognize, while maybe not impossible to perform, it is still so onerous to perform that I'm not going to require, or I'm not going to hold the party liable for not doing so. So I do want to stress the challenges of these doctrines. They I think sometimes are regarded as more available to parties than might really be the reality. And so if you are facing challenges with you being unable to perform your obligations, or you believe your counterparty is not performing its obligations, sort of go through a list, I would suggest, with your attorney of look hard at the contract, look hard at the force majeure clause, and is there even a force majeure clause? A lot of contracts don't have them. If it does have a force majeure clause, what are the specific events that are listed therein? If the specific events don't include epidemics, pandemics, government action, etc., then the next place to go would be, do I fall under some of the common law doctrines like impossibility or frustration of purpose? Those are closely related. And again, you sort of come back to the concept of being unable to perform because of an event outside of your control that was not anticipated by the parties when they entered into the contract. So whether the travel turning back to sort of the focus of this presentation, whether the travel restrictions render your performance impossible, after hearing what Carrie said and what Steve said, or sorry, Bobby said, and of course what Steve said, there are circumstances here where it really seems possible that if your performance is tied to some aspect of travel, then there may be good facts in support of a impossibility argument, force majeure, et cetera. If your obligations are not tied to travel, and there are some other ways of performing, like, you know, a video chat or something like that, and now all the work is done remotely, then the courts will expect you to try to accomplish the obligation through those alternative routes. That relates, I think, most challengingly for some parties to sort of like financing obligations. Right now, there's a lot of parties who are on the cusp of closing a deal, or were on the cusp of closing a deal when the shutdown orders in California and Pennsylvania and other states began to emerge, and the pace of those is just increasing. And parties are wondering, can I now not perform if I've already signed the deal? And the reason I ask is because now my bank, you know, now the financing is seizing up, and it's going to be much more difficult for me to get financing. Without, you know, giving legal advice or like overly predicting the future, that is a challenging argument to make. Turning back to 2008, that financial crisis, courts were quite hard on parties that were unable to perform because of the banks being unwilling to lend capital, even though that was a historically difficult time to get capital. Like, banks literally would not give any financing. The courts looked at the contracts and generally regarded the party who took on that obligation as being responsible for the risk that would occur. Now, there were some circumstances in which courts were a little bit more sympathetic and analyzed it under a commercial impracticability standard. And in those situations, the approach that the court sort of was more favorable to the non-performing party, were when the non-performing party did all it could to perform and just was not able to. So it looked to other financing sources, it negotiated extensions, it tried to negotiate with the other side and get to a resolution that didn't entail just walking away. And if there's one thing I could leave everybody with, it would be, if you are facing a challenge in which you cannot perform your obligations, I would strongly urge you to, you know, talk with your attorneys and find a route in which you just don't walk away for your obligations, but you try to find a way to perform and you try to negotiate with the other side. Because while a court may ultimately, you know, excuse non-performance sometime down the line if you don't perform, everybody, I say this as a litigator, everybody should avoid litigation. It's bad for my job to say that, but to be in court and try to defend why you didn't perform some years down the road is a type of hangover that I hope we can all avoid, you know, hangover from these events that I hope we can all avoid if possible. So that sometimes entails making a really good faith effort to explain to the other side why you can't perform, and talk about, can I perform in 4 months from now, or can we postpone this? Because the courts abhor a default. They really don't want parties to walk away from their contractual obligations. But at the same time, therefore, courts are much more sympathetic when you try to find some way to perform. So I'm going to wrap it up there, but if anybody has any questions, I'll look over this Q&A box here.
Well, I think everybody recognizes the risks of litigation. I think your suggestion, particularly in a situation like this with few precedents, the ability of the parties to figure out an amicable solution and negotiated settlement makes a lot of sense. I do note one of our attendees has pointed out he encountered a force majeure clause earlier this week that specifically includes a CDC level 3 travel advisory. So there are people out there who are thinking about this stuff, who are focusing on this and being prepared. So, which of course makes it harder for those who haven't. So, anyway, I'm going to turn over to Jason Reed. Jason is joining us just by audio conference, but Jason, I want to turn to you specifically about the reason we are here. And by that, I mean not COVID-19. What I mean is, I'm trying to get my video here. What I mean is the fact that we are all here on a webinar, that we are all using video conferencing technology and the internet to talk to each other. Can you talk a little bit about how businesses can adapt and prepare their networks and their technology solutions to ensure continuity of operations while employees and suppliers or customers are social distancing or otherwise physically absent from their normal work locations? And because he's joining by video, you'll just have to look at my ugly mug while he speaks. But Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Todd. The irony here being that the technologist doesn't have video access this morning. But let me piggyback a little bit to answer your question off of what Bobby mentioned and Will mentioned in terms of September 11th being a benchmark, not a good benchmark, but one, as we discuss, disaster recovery versus business continuity. And I'll preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer, and so the definition of disaster recovery is often one that requires folks to have a legal opinion to invoke disaster recovery. However, what we learned from September 11th is a couple of things from a technological standpoint. One is the bandwidth that was available to the globe, quite frankly. And by that, I'm talking about internet bandwidth, voice bandwidth, video bandwidth. And in the 19 years since then, that has exploded exponentially. And we all have capabilities in our homes, in our remote offices that far exceed what we did at that point. However, there's still a massive gap between those who have and those who don't have in terms of those capabilities. So regardless of whether you're a US customer of Comcast or Verizon or another provider, or an international consumer from other providers, the gap globally is very different than it was historically. So when we talk about that difference between remote working and the capabilities that we had for business continuity 19 years ago versus today, there's been a huge acceleration. However, it's probably human nature that we don't think about these things on a day-to-day basis. Because if you go into most of my customers, they'll talk about their disaster recovery plan, and they'll talk about their business continuity plans. And while they may not be 3-ring binders that get dusty on the shelf anymore, they're the electronic version of that. And so initiating a business continuity plan and tactically acting on it is a very different exercise. We see with our customers today, the reason that I'm not on video is that I'm traveling from customer to customer in a car mostly to help them ensure that they have the cybersecurity capabilities in place, that they have the help desk capabilities in place, that they have an understanding with their employees about the policies and procedures, and that they're communicating via the different modalities that we have today that we haven't had in the past. So for example, you may be managing your remote staff and your employees via text message. You may be managing them via instant messaging. You may have a variety of tools to remote access into your systems, but are they of the volume? Are they of the capability? Are they of the resiliency that you expect? It's clearly a different volume than you would expect on a work from home Friday or remote access when you might be having a family situation where you need to be in intermittent remote access. So today the challenges are quite different in doing so. We're more used to working remotely on an interim basis, but we have to understand whether or not the infrastructure to support that exists and what our expectations of our employees are as a result of that. I also noticed that in many of the questions and answers that are being posted, references to the last major event where folks were unintentionally sequestered at home is, what are your expectations of your employees and how are you measuring them? So while my area of expertise is around technology and technology enablement for large enterprises, there's an aspect of that of how are you effectively managing and communicating with your employees during this period? And I should expand that also to, we're talking about stakeholders as well. So, it's not just employees, it's consultants, contractors, it's vendors, as we've discussed. And I think, Will mentioned in his comments about default. What I've found and what we find in our consulting engagements is that best effort goes a long way. So that's not a legal opinion by any means, but none of us are alone in this, and we're all facing similar circumstances. So the extra effort to go a little bit further and to over communicate with customers, vendors, employees, consultants, and contractors goes a long way. And there's really not an excuse, a legitimate excuse, to do that in today's marketplace with all of the technology tools available to us. I'll make one more comment about this. As a global technology and financial advisory firm, we use capabilities just like many of you do. It's interesting to us in the last 2 weeks that we found that many of the professional providers of conference call services, of WebEx services, webinar services are struggling right now, while many of the free providers or the low-cost providers are thriving right now. And our hypothesis, it's purely a hypothesis right now, is that some of those legacy providers are just that, legacy. They were not designed or architected their systems for a situation like this. Whereas some of the freer, and Google's a good example here, Zoom is a good example, some of the lower cost providers who are recent entrants into the marketplace are using more contemporary technology that has been designed with this type of architecture, with cloud as their background, with software as a service as their background. And so, whereas we're dealing with many of our clients and having challenges, our clients are having challenges with their infrastructure because they've worked with legacy companies for many years, the new entrants are far more robust and reliable from this tiny sample size than what we've seen with some of the legacy providers. With that, I'm happy to take questions about anything remote working, technology infrastructure, how one might build a more contemporary business continuity plan, one that's actually realizable, if that's a word. And I'm also happy to entertain questions from the other panelists as well.
Perfect. That's great, Jason. And I think that you probably said some of the most important words that we've heard today, reminding us that none of us are alone in this. We are all working through these kind of issues together, and hopefully not a word that you hear a lot in business or industry, but empathy. I think people are learning patience is very valuable in a circumstance like this. So I appreciate those comments. Steve, I wanted to come back to you just for a little comment. I mean, again, we're all about social distancing and so forth. I mean, you want to maybe just take a minute to comment on the efficacy of some of that, or sort of the implications of how we're going forward here?
Sure. I think the best way to say it is that in order to stop the community spread, you have to spread the community. It's definitely been shown that the virus is spread by droplets. It can live on inanimate surfaces for days, cardboard for 24 hours. We have to be very compulsive when we are with other people about staying a bit of a distance away and good hygiene, washing our hands. We don't know the numbers yet in this country because we're not testing enough people. I think the numbers are going to keep peaking and we'll see daily changes. It doesn't mean the virus is going to continue getting worse, but I think 30 days on the travel ban may be a bit optimistic right now. We just don't know where this is going. It's clear, like I said earlier, it's a very virulent virus. It might have undergone some mutations, though it's becoming, we don't have good treatments. They've been talk about chloroquine, which was used for malaria. There's talk of an antiviral agent that Gilead Pharmacy is now checking in China. We're just in the beginning phases of a vaccination. So the only way to really minimize the spread of this is to keep away from large crowds and be very compulsive. If you're not feeling well, to self-quarantine yourself. And that has to go for young people too, who think they're immune, and maybe then contacting other people who are much more sensitive to this virus. And so, when I watch pictures of the kids partying on the beach in Florida, it really got my my hackles up, because it was, to me, one of the most irresponsible things that people could do now. And it's out in the media. We need to be very compulsive about spreading the community out and helping those that need help, but we have to be very, very cognizant of how this thing spreads.
I think those are wise words. And again, we hear these messages over and over. I mean, we're a chamber of commerce, but it's not really our forte. But I mean, I think it behooves us to all constantly be reminded of these basic things of, sing happy birthday twice while you wash your hands with hot water and soap, et cetera, et cetera. These are valuable lessons. So thanks for your comments. So now let's go to questions and answers. I mean, we've had quite a few folks come in with some Q&A. Carrie, I think we'll start specifically with you, and for our panelists, you can also see the questions that have come up. Carrie, I'll come first to you. There's a couple things here about H-1B visa applications and also about a B-1 visa holder.
Yeah, thank you. So if COVID-19 weren't happening, we still have a brand new system for H-1B visas that is in force this month. And it's very exciting for me because it's automating and modernizing the way that we handle H-1Bs for employers. H-1Bs are the classic employment-based visas. The good news is that program is not being impacted at all. It's run inside the United States by the Department of Homeland Security agency, USCIS. Registration, which is the data entry for H-1Bs for this next fiscal year cap, closes today. And USCIS has announced that between tomorrow and the 31st, we'll be notified of who's selected in the lottery. This is that visa lottery. And then we'll be able to file cases as of April 1st in a 90-day window. The only thing on H-1B lottery that's changed is that there will not be any premium processing for folks who know what that is. So again, there's no change to the H-1B lottery. This might impact folks' ability if they're outside the United States and selected in the H-1B cap lottery. It might impact their ability to get those visas and enter in October. But hopefully by then this will be cleared up and people will be able to go ahead and apply for those visas if they're outside the US. Regarding the B visa application, if you're already quote unquote maxed out on your B visa time and you overstay beyond that 1 year total, you will be considered to be violating status. There's no extension beyond that 1 year. But the Department of Homeland Security is expected to be somewhat lenient on these types of violations. You can also contact Customs and Border Protection, CBP, in the airport in which you entered and ask Customs and Border Protection to give you an extension. They have discretion to do that. It's called satisfactory departure, where they add 30 days. That has been limited so far to ESTA and the visa waiver program, but it might be added to other visa types. Finally, there was a question about a company or an organization in New York, and they have visas that expire in September. If the particular visa that is held cannot be renewed or extended, you should seek to change status. Talk to your immigration lawyer about changing status from your current visa status to B visa status. Filing an application is a purely administrative process. It doesn't take a lot of time or effort, but it would be the first step if needed to stay in the United States beyond the expiration of a visa that cannot be renewed or extended. I'll throw it back to you, Todd.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry, we're all learning how to do this together. So thank you. That's again, every situation is going to be individual. I mean, let's be clear. The advice that we're giving you is not legal advice. Talk to your attorneys, talk to your internet service providers, and so forth. We want to make sure people are clear on what we're giving. But again, this is going to be a situation that's going to be developing as we go forward. One thing I wanted to mention also for all of the audience, if there are specific questions that you'd like to follow up on with one of our speakers, we don't want to necessarily give out their email addresses here, but if you want to follow up, reach out to me or reach out to your local EACC chapter submit that request, and we will put you in direct contact with folks like Jason, like Carrie, like Will, etc. Dr. Langer, I mean, one other question that came in was about these people being encouraged to return to Europe. I mean, given the fact that the virus is spreading, in places like Italy, I mean, is that logical advice?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. And I think, again, we have to assume that because there's a 14-day incubation period with this virus, a lot of people can be asymptomatic and still be infectious. They may not even develop symptoms. Some symptoms may be mild. So I think to say it's okay for somebody to go back to another area that is vulnerable, I think is unwise at this time.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Any kind of travel seems to be ill-advised, regardless of the circumstances. So, I'm not seeing a lot of other questions come in. So let me go ahead. I mean, I don't think anybody's ever going to be upset if we wrap up a webinar early, which I think is a fine thing. So I am going to go ahead and finish up with a couple of remarks. First of all, as I said, if you want to be in touch with any of the panelists, please reach out to your local EACC chapter, and we can make that contact happen for you. We don't want to blow up people's email boxes with information. I wanted to mention also, we will, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this webinar. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel. You will be able to find it there early next week. As this situation is developing, obviously we're working hard to, we as the EACC are working hard to develop more information and more webinars and programs that give your businesses the information that they need to do better business, even in spite of the current challenges. So if you have suggestions for that kind of content, if you have content that you would like to share in this webinar format, please let us know. Again, contact your local chapter and let them know what you'll be doing, and stay in touch with your local chapter for other webinars and other events that we may be hosting. So that is going to conclude today's webinar entitled "The World on Lockdown: Global COVID-19 Related Travel Restrictions and the Impact on Transatlantic Business." I want to offer, on behalf of you and myself, thanks to Carrie Koski, Dr. Stephen Langer, Jason Reed, Bobby Spann, and Will Taylor for sharing your experience and your insight today. And of course, thanks to everyone who has joined us in today's discussion. We will hope to see you at another EACC event in the near future, and wish you all well, and go now wash your hands. All the best. Bye.
Thank you.